Hello, I'm Bruce Moe of CommonWealth Magazine, and I'd like to welcome you to a virtual town hall tonight dealing with race, the coronavirus, and police brutality. Our state and our nation are grappling with issues that are as old as the country itself, and many are wondering right now if we've finally reached a point where real change is possible. Hosting the discussion tonight is a former two-term governor of Massachusetts with a unique perspective on the issues from both a personal and professional level. Please welcome our host for the evening, Deval Patrick.
Thank you, Bruce, and good evening, everyone. We apologize for the technical difficulties. I don't know about any of you, but I spend a great deal of time on Zoom and other things these days, and I'm frequently faced with the experience where I know I look like I'm trying to tune a VCR to those who are watching. We on behalf of CommonWealth and our very, very capable producer and engineer, I apologize for the delay. But let's get to the conversation. We've got an amazing panel of thought leaders and serious people with deep life experience, and I'm looking forward to the discussion with them. I'm happy to welcome Dr. Myechia Minter-Jordan, who is the president and CEO of DentaQuest Partnership and a community health leader. Also, Juana Matias, the COO of MassINC and a former member of the legislature, and Dr. Lee Pelton, president of Emerson College and a thought leader in education and beyond. Welcome, everyone. Delighted to have you tonight. So let's get started. What's going on? I had a conversation with a friend of mine, a prominent African-American businesswoman, just the other day, and she started the call by saying that all of her white friends and colleagues have been calling to ask if she's okay. And she said she can tell which ones are really asking that and which ones are asking whether she thinks they are okay. What is happening around us and what is different from before? Myechia, may I start with you?
Sure. I think we are experiencing a trifecta, a crippling trifecta at that. We are highlighting racial and social inequities in terms of being in the worst pandemic in the century, the horrible rates of unemployment, almost 17% for African Americans, and a social uprising as a result of the murder of George Floyd. And when you take the confluence of all of that and you add in the fact that we're now able to see data in ways that we hadn't been able to see before that highlight those inequities in healthcare, we're now able to see for ourselves, although many of us have already known and experienced some of the racial injustices, we're now able to see that via video. Social media is spreading it. And then we also have a lack of coordinated response at the federal level that's ignited local leadership in our efforts. So I think when you take all of that together, it really has changed the perspective, changed the conversation. And I think we're getting a lot more as people of color questions from those who are reaching across and saying, what is going on? How can I help? How can I be an ally? Mm-hmm. Because it's just at this point undeniable.
Yeah. Lee?
Well, you know, I get it this time is this a moment? Well, it's not a moment. It's a movement. Mm-hmm. And this is a movement that's been in making for quite a while. You know, I think, you know, as a lot of folks have said, you know, Black folks are sick and tired of being sick and tired. What that means is that the platitudes that usually come out during these kinds of events, oftentimes from marketing offices and so on, will not do. And I think people have to understand that, and this is what makes me nervous, that this is something to be fixed. But it's not something to be fixed. This is going to require a significant, long-term, continuous effort.
Normally, how have you experienced and observed what's going on around us in Boston and Massachusetts and America today?
I didn't hear the first part of your question.
No, I was asking Juana if can you hear me, Juana? Just wanted you to weigh in. How are you experiencing what's going on around us in our communities in our country today?
No, to add to what Lee was saying, I think we've had past inflection points around this issue of race and inequality in our country. And America had the opportunity to really address the racial inequality, the injustice, the lack of inclusion that's existed for people of color for some time, and they haven't done so. So I think that the ongoing events we're seeing currently are really shedding light on the fact that we need transformative change, change that will dismantle the institutional racism that has existed and that's excluded people of color from, being able to socially and economically and politically participate in our democracy. I'm hopeful that those that are in power are going to take this opportunity to really undo these wrongs that have existed for some time. I think that in order for that to happen, though, we really need to have some serious conversations. And like Lee mentioned, be really committed to doing this long term, because this has been entrenched in a part of our fabric since the beginning, since the inception of this country.
To that point, I want to remember a comment that candidate Obama made not long after Katrina, when he talked about how all those folks who were abandoned on those rooftops were abandoned before that storm. Mm-hmm. And we thought, a lot of us, that that was a moment that would catalyze a movement and we would get at some of the chronic issues and challenges that have faced Black people, but it didn't quite happen then. I keep hearing people say this is different. Juana, is this different right now?
I think it's TBD, to be determined. I think that, like you just mentioned, we've been talking about this for some time. However, if we don't see changes in the diversity of governance, right? If our elected officials do not reflect the communities they're there to serve, I think some of these issues are going to go unheard. Mm-hmm. I was a member of the legislature, and I was in those rooms where I would look to my left and I'd look to my right, and it'd be surrounded by white males. And a lot of the needs of the most underserved communities were not being brought up or amplified. So I think if you look at the powers that be currently in our legislature, our leadership in the House, our leadership in the Senate, currently all white. Not one person of color sits in the rooms where decisions are being made and agendas are being prioritized. Mm-hmm. So unless that changes, I think we're not going to see the urgency and the merit that many of these issues require. However, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that, not just government will do and play its role, but also that the media will bring forth these issues to the front line and hold those in power accountable in a way that really brings true change to these inequities. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Myechia, we were just talking earlier about whether this is different. Are we, have you seen patterns in the past about how we in America have dealt with race, or have you experienced an evolution in your own way of dealing with being a Black woman in the world, in the professional world, in the world generally?
I think the difference is you hear people with good intentions, and I think now where we need to shift to is policy. And we definitely want someone of color on the board. It will be nice. Now there's the data that shows that you're more effective if you have diversity. And we have to marry that with policy. So when I look at these companies coming out with these statements, how are you backing that up? How are you changing your policies? And how are you, to the point that was just raised, changing the power dynamic within your companies, within your organization, within your institution? I think for many, many years, I've been one of the only, as many of us have experienced. And I'm starting to see, and I'm also starting to be more vocal myself about asking and demanding policy change, and not feeling just sort of lucky to be in the room and let me play nice and make sure everyone feels comfortable. But I think we have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable and ask those tough questions. And when we are that one person in the room, ask for and demand policy change. And I think that's the shift that I'm beginning to experience as a result of everything that we're experiencing right now.
So interesting that you bring up this point about making others feel comfortable, specifically Black people in positions of, in professional or in positions of power, feeling like we have to make white people comfortable before we can, do anything, move the ball, get the conversation going. Lee, You wrote a powerful open letter to the Emerson community. It was not just or even mainly about policy. It was about how you felt right now. And can I ask you to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I didn't expect to receive all the attention that it did. You know, it's all reached about 8 million people around the globe. But the purpose was to make the invisible visible, and to make the invisible visible by talking about my own personal history, but also by making Mr. Floyd visible. Because as I said in the letter, I think it was his invisibility and the cruel dehumanization of him by a white police officer that permitted him to put his knee on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds with his left hand casually placed in his pocket. As he said, as Mr. Floyd said, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. And before he lost consciousness, he called on his mama, his deceased mama. Right. So I wanted to connect his history with the founding of this country and the structural racism that has, and I'm not just talking about bigotry here, racism. I'm talking about the structural racism that's built into the fabric of this world in which we live, this country in which we live, from its founding, beginning with, now 400 years of slavery and Jim Crowism. And so, in a way, and I want to say this so you understand it, Mr. Floyd's death was not the problem. It was a symptom of a larger problem that has existed for hundreds of years. And that's what I wanted to bring to light.
And you did beautifully. I commend that letter. Talk about the structural racism, the term structural racism. I find that there's a defensiveness that sometimes comes when we talk about structural racism, as if we are saying everybody white is a racist. And some people may say that, but everybody white is a hater. And the comeback is, surely not everybody is a hater, and we get stuck. Can you say a little bit more about what you mean by structural racism? I'm going to ask each of the panelists to reflect on that a little bit too.
Well, it shows up in all the disparities. There is a wealth gap. There's certainly in this nation. There's a wealth gap. In Boston, there is an achievement gap. There is a equity gap. There is a home ownership gap. There is a net wealth and income gap in this city, which is startling. And we could look at corporate America, and corporate America has failed Black Americans. And the coronavirus has exacerbated these structural deficiencies. Half of the Black Americans are out of a job in this pandemic that we are in. Black workers continue to make less than white workers. That's structural. And if you look at CVS, Bank of America, JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, and you ask how many Black folks are on the C-suite in those companies, the answer is none. If you look on the tech side and you look at Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, you ask the same question, that is zero. So that's what's meant by structural racism.
Myechia?
So when I think about structural racism as from the perspective of a physician, I think about the fact that there's a life expectancy difference of 30 years within a 5-mile distance between the Back Bay and Roxbury. And you think about, why is that? There's different policies in terms of housing policies. There's different educational opportunities. There's different job opportunities depending upon where you live and your accessibility to transportation. And so when you think about the structure within which people live and thrive, when that system is set up for you to be only be able to buy a house in a certain area that is more polluted and has less access to jobs and education, and then you couple that with the life expectancy difference that is so extreme on top of income disparities.
Yeah.
That's the structure that we're dealing with right now, that we need to affect change within and change policy so that people aren't having to succumb to that level of depravity in terms of access to all the resources that we should enjoy as Americans.
Right. Juana, say something about structural racism, just again, helping our viewers understand what it is we're talking about.
Yeah, I think I'll bring in my perspective as an attorney and being in our court system, where if you are a person of color and you've been convicted of a crime, depending on your race, your class, the access to money and a network you have to finding an attorney is determinative of what's going to happen to you. So justice is not being served. And we see that very clearly in our criminal justice system. And, we talk about reform, but reform alludes to improving something, amending something. And I think it's incredibly important in this conversation and in this space for us to recognize that from the very beginning, our system was absolutely broken. And it was not right in terms of how we treat people of color in this country. And I think there are a lot of reforms that we could be talking about, and I think Lee and Myechia mentioned a lot of them. Our K through 12 system continues to see disparities between students of color and white students. There's a widening achievement gaps. We continue to see our state not invest in pathways that could really lead to economic mobility. We know that higher ed makes a big difference. However, we've seen continued disinvestment in the state. It's a great way to ensure intra-generational wealth. And a lot of our institutions, our most underserved institutions, are serving our most marginalized communities. So how do we invest resources in places that actually can make a difference? We talked about housing. We know, and we should look at the durability of segregation, right? We need to acknowledge it. We need to address it. And that starts with housing choice. That starts with dismantling zoning regulations that continue to concentrate poverty in our communities across the state and in our public schools. And, I think if we have the right leadership, people that are there to serve, who want to address these inequities that exist in our system, we can actually start dismantling some of this.
I am so glad that you got to this point about reform versus what sometimes is described as reimagining what our systems do. I find that you guys are supposed to do most of the talking, but I can't resist on this point. This notion of structural racism is sometimes so often received as an accusation about otherwise good-hearted and well-intended policymakers trying to improve, as you say, existing policies. And mind you, I'm not just talking about government. I'm talking about in the private sector, in the commercial world, in the not-for-profit world. But I think what we're talking about is tying back from the impact on Black people today to decisions that were made in policy a generation or two or more ago. The wealth gap on its own, if you have no historical context, could be, as it is in the minds of many, an economic challenge. But the fact that so much of that generational wealth has been dependent on access, on owning a home and getting the appreciated value, and that there were specific decisions made, some of them in our lifetimes and some of them beforehand, that prevented Black families from making those same investments and reaping the benefit of those investments in the same way, getting the value of that equity creation, and that lingers and compounds over generations. That to me, it's like the other day, I was talking to someone who was looking to hire a senior person. This has been a a medical company, medical-related, healthcare-related company, and they had listed all the qualifications, and so I was told, and then they said, and the person must be a tenured professor at a medical school. Now, if that's what you do and what you've always done, you'll always get what you always got. But no one had examined until the person who was telling me this story whether being a tenured professor in medical school was actually necessary from a skill set point of view of getting that job done. So all of a sudden, they had constrained the field of potential competitors for that spot by using a reference point that has its own limitations on account of race. That's what I think we're talking about when we talk about structural, and the unwillingness, I think, of policymakers to get right at that and sort of say, well, it's just economics, as if they were willing to deal with chronic poverty as well, has been a real source of frustration. So let's start with the police. If we're not going to reform the police, what should we do? Or is reform enough? Myechia, start with you?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So I think about, I draw a parallel to healthcare. Providers, doctors, for a very long period of time, were so protective of our field that no one else could deliver care. We all had to do it. It had to be the provider and the interaction with the patient. You look at community health workers and how community health workers are able to deliver care to the patient from the community, provided economic prosperity to those community health workers, improved the connection between the patient and someone from their community delivering healthcare. Yep. And so I think that's reimagining healthcare and beginning to take down some of those prerequisites for being able to deliver care and how we think about care. Mm-hmm. And I think that we can take that analogy and apply it to policing. I know there's been this back and forth of late about community policing, but we know that when people come from the community, there's an interaction and a trust that is built between those people and those that they should be serving. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's a real opportunity for us to rethink how we police people, but really, how do we protect people? It's really less about policing and more about protecting.
Mm-hmm. And Myechia, is there a personal experience that informs how you arrived at that view about what needs to happen now?
Well, I think about how we redefine access, and I think about what my patients are telling me that they need, or what they told me that they needed, in terms of someone who understood them, someone who understood. And my own experience is that when I walked into the room as a person of color, the relief on my patient's face when they thought that they could connect to me and they thought that I would have their best interest at heart. Mm-hmm. And that trust was immediately built from the time I walked into the room. Right. So we look at that in every profession, and we know that cultural competency matters. Mm-hmm. And whether or not that's that they look like me or they have similar experiences, that matters in the interaction, and it matters in our ability to interact effectively.
Mm-hmm. Lee, can I come to you? How do you think about 21st century policing and what, if anything, in your own personal story brings you there?
Well, as I said in my letter, I've had my own encounters with police. None of them were happy. Mm-hmm. I'm probably like a lot of black men my age. When I see a police officer's car in my rearview mirror, I'm nervous. Mm-hmm. I really do. And that's something that's lasted for half a century for me. Mm-hmm. So I think there are certain things that we can do with respect to police brutality. One is we need to teach officers how to de-escalate situations, because the training right now for most police enforcement officers is to bring brute force quickly and immediately mm-hmm. to control a situation. That's what happens. But I know that there are some police, law enforcement agencies in various cities that have really spent a lot of time committed to teaching de-escalation. Mm-hmm. you can talk people through these situations. You really can. We need more of that.
Mm-hmm.
But the police, it's a guild, G-U-I-L-D,
Mm.
and it's protectionist by nature. And I know that there are many mayors in this city, in this country, who are frustrated when they try to bring charges against officers, and the labor unions resist and allow a lot of this kind of brutality to persist. You know, many years ago, some of us will recall the establishment of these citizen review boards.
Right.
Some of those are effective, but I think there's a sense that a lot of those, well-intentioned, have become calcified and not very effective, and they've become a kind of rubber stamp for a lot of the stuff that we see today.
So let me just, you know, I completely agree about the importance of emphasizing de-escalation and as a first response, but there is still this issue of valuing the life of Black people differently, right? George Floyd was subdued. He was cuffed. He had one or two other officers with their knees on his back. And yet, Officer Chauvin, I think it is, kept suffocating the life out of him. In some ways, the many really chilling images we've seen in the last little while, the one of Amy Cooper in Central Park might be, for me, the most revealing. That didn't have anything to do with the police, but there she was, you know, pretending to be threatened by a Black man while on the phone with the police, because she knew by just pretending she could rain holy hell down on the head of that Black man. What is that about? You know, you understand what I'm getting at? That just it's one thing somebody's running away. Why is it then that an officer would think it's okay to empty his ammunition clip into that person's back? What is that? And
we have to
enough.
Yeah. We have to reconstruct law enforcement in this country.
Yeah.
De-escalation is part of it, but we need to reconstruct it.
Yeah.
And I'm supportive of defunding the police. We're obviously going to have the police, but we have to defund it and strip it of all of its militarization, which is so much a part of the culture now. And as some cities and mayors are thinking about doing, which is to redistribute some of that money to some of the structural issues that we're talking about right now, with in terms of healthcare and education and jobs and so on. So we really need to just reconstruct, almost from the bottom up, really, our law enforcement culture.
Let's talk a little bit more about that idea of how we've been asking the police to do what we used to ask a whole variety of other service providers to do. I actually think it's an issue for teachers as well. Juana, would you? How do you think about that? When you hear defund the police, what does that evoke for you, and how should we be thinking about policing going forward?
Well, I think you were touching, as you were mentioning, that white woman calling the police and using her white privilege, this profound reality that Black lives are devalued significantly. And it's not just in policing. I think we can see it across sectors and policy. And I don't think that defunded should be the place we go to. I think that currently in Massachusetts, there's a requirement of 40 hours of training that isn't happening across our municipalities. How do we get EOPs to ensure that this is happening, that there's bias and prejudice training that includes the rethinking of how police officers do their work? Is the civil service exam the best prerequisite in determining who will be a good police officer, right? Where like police officers are at the intersection of poverty, lack of resources. And so how do we make sure that we're really equipping the people that are supposed to sustain public safety with the education and resources they need? And I think currently we're not doing that as a Commonwealth. And I think that's where the conversation needs to start. And that's where we really need to see some further investments. And I think it takes us to, a profound question. There are clearly biases and prejudices against people of color that our white counterparts need to kind of recognize and acknowledge and start dismantling within themselves.
There's a line I heard, I think it was at one of the hearings in the last week or so, where one of the witnesses said about policing, he said, we want in the Black community the kind of policing they get in the white community. But this notion that we managed to politicize almost everything. I never in my wildest dreams would I have thought you could politicize a pandemic, but somehow or other we managed to do that these days. The counter chant to Black Lives Matter was for a time Blue Lives Matter. We still hear this, or All Lives Matter. How do we get to a place where you're made to feel like you have to hate the police to believe Black Lives Matter? What is that? I know it's an impossible question, but maybe Lou, ask you to start.
Well, it may be all lives matter, right? I think we would all agree to that.
Yeah.
But that's not the issue that we're dealing with right now. The issue that we're dealing with right now is Black lives. And there's a profound sense that for some folks, they don't matter. And they don't matter, Amy Cooper. She revealed herself on camera. And so that's a latent racism. It's built into her structure and into her DNA.
Well, and in some of the interviews she's given, or some of the comments she's given, that is not how she sees herself.
Yeah, well, of course.
Juana touched on this a minute ago. That isn't, I think to myself, when she was still working at that firm, she was looking at resumes, reviewing candidates, saying this, I feel like this one or this one is not a fit. We've all heard that term. But she didn't see herself as racist. Myechia, come into the conversation. Help us understand, because I have a feeling all of us know people like Amy Cooper.
Sure.
Help us help the Amy Coopers in our lives understand what their work needs to be.
I think part of what we're hearing, and I don't disagree in terms of the dehumanization of Black people, and that's historical, right? So we think about, and when people were enslaved, how it was the white woman was this object to be protected, and that I think that's pervasive throughout this time. And I think part of it is understanding that, right? Understanding that people see you in that way as a white woman or a white man, and you see yourself in that light as well. And how and the lens that changes when it's a Black woman who is thought to be stronger, nothing can break her back. She's angry. She's this woman who doesn't need protection. And Black men are these, brutes who are only good for working hard. I mean, all of these notions, I think we see them repeated again and again in movies. Now I look at Netflix, and now all of a sudden these Black movies are at the top of as soon as you go into search. But the majority of those movies are about drug dealers and or are about, you know, people who live in unfortunate circumstances. There are very little movies that are like sort of like the Cosby Life, and not a reference to Bill Cosby, but that image of a successful Black family. Very little about that's out there in the media that changes some of the ideas that people have about Black men and women. And so I think part of it is understanding that as an Amy, to understand how you're seeing the world and to have authentic conversations with the people that you do know. Like, what are their experiences? I was on a call the other day with a number of women, very powerful women in Massachusetts, and the women of color were sharing their stories. And they were so surprised to hear the story like the one that you shared, Lee, and about the injustice that we experience, even though we're sitting in that same room. They just, for some reason, didn't think that that happened to us. And it was pretty incredible for them to hear it, to then become empathetic, and then to say, I bet if I ask all of my friends, we all have a story. Every single person of color has a story of experiencing injustice. And that is a lens that we have on this world. And I think we need more authentic conversations so that people understand that.
Yeah, someone sent my wife a message that was tweeted out by a young Black man who was saying, to all my white friends who ask what they can do, he said, what you can do is let your guard down and listen. And that is a part of the journey that I hope this moment brings us. We have some questions from some of our viewers that came in earlier. I think one we've touched on about the history of when police departments started to acquire military gear and equipment, how much of current police department budgets in the city of Boston and elsewhere are dedicated to the purchase of essentially weapons that were designed for military, not domestic policing purposes. I don't know if anyone has those stats, but this is a practice that was that I know has gone on for maybe 15 or 20 years, that President Obama started to wind it down, in fact, suspended it. And then that decision, like so many of his others, were reversed by President Trump when he came in. But is there a relation, do you believe, and maybe Juan, I'll start with you, that you believe in the level of brutality and the level of weaponry that police departments have become equipped with?
I think there's definitely concerns in terms of, what Lee had been mentioning. Why aren't we utilizing methods of de-escalation? And I think, the racism that's existed and the devaluing of Black lives comes into perspectives. And I think it touches on a point that Myechia was mentioning, and is, how do we get our police forces to be diverse, to be representative of the communities they're supposed to be maintaining public safety in? I've admired one of the things that our local mayor has done here in the city of Lawrence, and that's hiring more police officers of color who are culturally competent, who speak Spanish, who know how to engage the community in a way that de-escalates things, right? And there's just cultural ways that you can avoid a situation from escalating. So I think things like that should be considered. And, ongoing education. This is an area where you're not required to receive education. And in our state, I think we have an opportunity right now, and we're seeing some of our elected officials, from the executive office to the House of Representatives and the Senate, start considering some measures that we should be implementing. And I think diversifying the pipeline of police officers should be a priority.
There's a question here, if I'm just going to read it. Gang violence is certainly partly a result, says the questioner, of a generation of Black fathers and many young Black men being incarcerated. How can we heal this generation that has been deserted by society? Obviously, we aren't doing a very good job now. Healing has to take place within the society as a whole. Aren't you worried about the summer months without anything for young people to do? Well, Lee?
Well, it's about offering opportunities. The mayor does have a program to provide job opportunities for young people. And I know that obviously in this two-dimensional Zoom world we now live in, those jobs will look different, but I do know that there's some companies that have still stepped up to the plate. And gang violence is, it's a result. It's rooted in oftentimes in poverty. It's rooted in, again, the kinds of structural racism that we're talking about, the lack of educational opportunities for folks, folks who don't see, a lot of these young people don't see, a future for them that exists outside the narrow confines of their life. Now, I am not an expert on this, and I don't mean to speak for all of those young men and women, but from where I sit, those are the issues.
Yeah, Myechia?
Yeah, I don't think there's a single young Black man who wakes up saying, I want to be a member of a gang and kill people and perhaps die early myself. I think we young people, or they young people, look for ways in which to belong. And I think Lee has nailed it in terms of educational opportunities, economic opportunities, and engaging our youth. And when you don't do that, that's what's left. And so I think that's an important consideration, and really thinking about gang violence is really the cause, and not is not the cause, it's really the symptoms. And we really need to treat the cause of this, right? So if we are changing the way in which we engage youth, and I give the mayor a lot of credit, and the mayor before him, in terms of the employment opportunities for youth that came out of both of their offices and their administrations, and really trying to get more jobs out, corporations to step up and hire young people. And I think the other point that Lee raised in terms of role models, as you well know, Governor Patrick, my husband runs a program for young men and exposes those young men to people they would never have had the opportunity to encounter, like yourself, like, Mr. Pelton, people who are in these professions, and they open a door to show them what's possible. When you don't see that, and you live every day in a place where you never see anyone who looks like you succeed, unless they're on TV, then that's all you know. And so I think part of what we have to do is really get to the cause, and not just the symptom of gang violence. It's a horrible thing, but there's so many deep reasons as to why that exists, that are structural in nature, that we need to address.
Yeah. Juana?
Yeah, no, I agree with both what Myechia and Lee mentioned. And I think that the next test for the Commonwealth will be our state budget. Every time we see recessions, we slash funding for youth jobs, for gang prevention, for after-school programs. And I think, data is demonstrating that our prison population is continuing to decline. So I want to see if there's going to be true leadership here in our state. Are we going to take the savings from the decline in our prison population and reinvest them where they need to be, from policing to the disparities we continue to see in the juvenile and adult court system, to the investments that the majority of people who are leaving our prison systems, people of color, need in terms of reintegrating back into society. So I think I look forward to seeing a budget that speaks to the needs and it responds to what we've been seeing across this country.
It's such an important point. And the way I think of it is the incredible emphasis in short-term politics to short-term political outcomes instead of long-term, substantive impact on people's lives. You think about, trickle-down economics. That is the source, in large measure, of the income inequality we see today. No new taxes, as if anybody runs for office for the purpose of raising taxes. But when you put taxation off the table, then you just move other stuff around. Never mind that a third grader gets her chance at the third grade right now. Not later on when you're feeling flush. It's like we have so underinvested across the country for 40 years or more in capacity building, right? Education, the kinds of opportunities, experiential learning that you have described, the in the infrastructure that enables people to get to and from work in an economy that we want to grow out to the middle and the marginalized and not just up to the well connected. And then we wonder why it is that people feel hopeless and left out and unseen. So that, you know, to your point, Juana, in state and local budgets, in the federal budget, we ought to be looking for, and frankly, we ought to start to develop a consensus around what we want to see in a series of investments that readjust our resources and reimagine our tomorrow, so that we are investing not just for the next election cycle, but for the next generation. I think that's, in a way, how I see what we've been talking about in just this section. Maybe I'll take one more question, if I may, from our viewers, because I know we're getting near the end of our time. Let's see. Questions I was thinking about are about if there are any public health measures that other states or cities have taken and that they wish were more widely adopted. I was also wondering about how to ensure there's good representation in a coalition type group. We take the first one first. You know of good public health, Myechia, good public health models that you'd like to see replicated here at home?
Well, I think, you know, Massachusetts has done, well, first, I think the mayor's declaration of racism as a public health issue is important. And I think that's important for us because that kind of issuance also then helps direct funding and helps direct policy. And so I think that the Boston Public Health Commission, which I was pleased to be able to serve as a commissioner on for several years, has started to do this initiative of looking at race in all policies. And I think that kind of declaration will help us to do that, whether or not that's housing, whether or not that's jobs, whether or not that's access to healthcare, in all policies. And so I think Massachusetts is a leader in that regard. Clearly much more work to do. I think one of our learnings on the mayor's COVID-19 task force for health inequities was using the data to direct resources. So as opposed to making presumptions about why a certain area of Roxbury is experiencing more COVID-19 infections than another, it's really taking the data down to the neighborhood, down to the street to understand the impact of the disease, of this virus on those communities, and then using that data to direct resources. And I think that's something that I had not seen before, and I think should be a best practice of using data, not for the sake of saying there are inequities and then not doing anything about it, but using that to then reallocate resources, which I think is really important. So I would say Massachusetts and Boston is a leader in that regard. I'm not familiar with other states and how they may be doing that work, but I know that the important work of using the data here is what really has enabled us to slow the tide of COVID-19, particularly in communities of color.
Okay. Juana, do you want to speak to public health models or other models in response to the issues we've been talking about that you'd like to see replicated here in Massachusetts?
Yeah, I think one area that, you were mentioning stakeholders, how do we engage them? And I think at MassINC, we do a lot of engaging, but our biggest concern, especially under our purview of the Gateway City Innovation Institute, is that you look at our gateway cities and you look at the nonprofit makeup of these gateway city, the board makeup, the private sector makeup, the elected makeup, and it's not representative of these communities. So even when you try to bring in nonprofit stakeholders, private stakeholders, they aren't representative of the community they seek to serve. So I think there needs to be a lot more intentionality behind ensuring that executive directors, that boards are really bringing in the voices that are not a part of these discussions across our gateway cities, across our Commonwealth, in our state, because we can have all of the policies we want, but if the people who are at the forefront and at the helm of some of these institutions don't understand the importance of why these voices need to be a part of the conversation, we're not going to see these things be implemented. So that's an area where I think we need a lot more work, especially when you look at the fact that our gateway cities are predominantly immigrant communities, but you don't see them in any way represented in the places where decisions are being made.
So let me build on that. Lee, let me bring you in. Just this whole question of how you develop coalitions that treat what ails us as just not what ails us, but what ails all of us. Do you understand?
Yeah.
This notion, even now, the notion that the only issue we're really talking about is excessive use of force by police, rather than its root causes in a dynamic created by disinvesting in human capability,
Right.
and the fact that is easy to do because the people making decisions are so often not of the community affected. How do we make folks downtown
Well,
like they have a stake in Roxbury?
yeah, I'm going to answer this a little differently, and maybe it's a different question. This is, as I said, this is not a moment, it's a movement. And the movement is being led in new ways. First of all, the leadership is decentralized. And it's, and it's a variety of leaders. And these are young folks, some of them in high school, others in college. And so they are leading the way. And they're very adept at the use of social media. So they can call together a protest, in 15 minutes, and
we're trying to
1,000
figure out how
folks.
to turn on Facebook Live, I'm telling you.
Yeah, exactly. So this is not 1965. This is a different approach. And the approach is that change requires some discomfort. It's got you have to discomfort old ways of thinking, the old structures, and that's the way to bring about change. And so I see this as a movement, but it's a lot different movement than MLK marching. It's even a different movement than Stokely Carmichael and H. Rap Brown and SNCC and all of that. It's a different kind of movement. It's a 21st century movement that's aided and abetted by technology, and I think that it has some endurance.
Does that make you hopeful?
Yeah, it does make me hopeful. But those of us on this call, we're part of the power structure. So we're going to be uncomfortable too. As a college president, I'm going to be uncomfortable because I know that a lot of these issues will come to my campus, so
yeah,
it's a new world.
Yeah.
I think just really, really quickly, the other difference I'd say that in terms of the current protests, and having gone to a couple myself, is the diversity there, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's a big difference between what happened in terms of the civil rights movement, although there were allies there. Having seen the pictures, I'm young enough, but old enough to have seen the pictures and to understand the history, but young enough not to have been there. But what I'm experiencing now is I was surrounded at Franklin Park, 10,000 people surrounded by people who didn't look like me, which was remarkable. And I think as long as that energy keeps, it can't just be, this only impacts the Black community, it impacts all of us. And so I think as long as we continue to understand and believe and fight for the rights of everyone, human rights, then I think that this will continue. But if it becomes only a Black issue and the media, to the point that was raised, shifts and makes us all about, this is just those Black people, then I don't think we're going to continue this movement in the way that it has developed. And I don't see that happening because there's a lot of energy around this being a human rights issue around the world.
Yeah,
I would agree with that. I'm sorry. I would also say that this is what we're watching as leadership training. These young people are in training to be the next generation of leaders. We saw that in the Black Lives movement and Matter movement, and so we're going to see that here too.
Juana, what makes you hopeful?
I think seeing these protests happening across our country has been uplifted. seeing young people at the forefront of this, demanding change, is uplifting and makes me hopeful. However, I have been in those rooms. And as Lee was mentioning, you have a group of people here who have been a part or are part of these power structures. And so I want to see action.
Mm-hmm.
I want to see action. I think, it's about walking the walk, not talking the talk. And I think for generations and generations, people of color have been left behind. And I think it's on our white counterparts to be a part of this fight, to be allies, and to ensure that this moment that we're living right now doesn't just become another inflection point in America's history.
Yeah. Good. I've been thinking that, we have for a lot of years now been treating justice as if it was in a, limited supply. So if somebody got a little bit over here, you had to take away from somebody over there. And I've been holding my breath after the initial feeling of incredible grief and rage at once after the George Floyd video was released, about whether we would, whether our sort of famously short attention span in this country would flip to something else. I held my breath when those few hooligans were doing what they did, because I knew how easily we get distracted from the overwhelmingly peaceful marchers and protesters otherwise on the street. And I held my breath to see whether folks would keep coming out. They have been peaceful. They have been more and more diverse. And that makes me hopeful too. In very practical terms, it's an interesting thing. I think, Myechia, you used the term about confluence, because I do think, or convergence. There are ways in which the experience of economic alienation and social isolation, economic uncertainty, I guess is what I want to say, fragility, social isolation, some of the ways in which opioids have come in to fill that gap, some of the challenges of chronic despair and being or feeling stuck that Black people have felt for generations is an experience now that people are feeling in a whole lot of other places today. And the pandemic exposed just how much unfinished business there is in all kinds of communities. And so I feel hopeful, thanks to the leadership, the young and diverse leadership of the marchers today, that they may actually demand of those in power, Juana, not just promises, but real action. And I'm hoping that those in power get back in the habit of trying things. Not everything's going to work, but trying things, big ideas that are about innovating in our policy so that we leave some lasting good behind for another generation, not just in time for the next election. I think we're at the end of our time. I just ask, that was my final thought. May I ask Juana if you would offer a minute or two, and then we'll go right around.
Yeah, no, I think that there's an opportunity for us to seize this moment and undo wrongs that have existed in our country for generations. And I urge, our government agencies, our media outlets to act with the urgency and merit that this issue deserves.
Thank you. Myechia?
Yeah, I think we need to continue authentic conversations. And I think people of color who are in powerful positions, we need to leverage our power too. And I think what I said earlier about not playing into, we need to be comfortable, we need to secure our spot, but I think there's so much more that leaders of color can do. And I also encourage everyone to be a leader. I think, as you mentioned, high school kids, people who are stepping up and saying, this matters to me, I'm going to make a change. That, I think, is that energy that we need to continue. It's not just on the leaders who need to step up, but it's also on the community to really make sure that we're hearing those voices and that they are taking those positions of leadership. And I'm really encouraged by that.
Thank you. Lee, bring us home.
Well, if I can quote a French philosopher, the future is not what it used to be. And the future is uncertain to me, but I know it's not what it used to be, and I'm looking forward to the future.
Amen.
Yes, indeed.
Well, I want to thank each and every one of you for bringing so much in this short amount of time around issues that have layers and layers and layers. We didn't talk on purpose about specific policy, or we didn't dwell on that in large part because I think this may be one of those times where we just need to, all of us together in our community, black and white and everyone else, feel this deeply and genuinely so we can understand from that feeling what it is we need to do in our own lives, in our workplaces, in our relationships with our friends and our neighbors, in our businesses. Let's not leave them out, and in our public policy at the local, state, and federal level. We have elections coming up. This is not a political plug or a partisan plug, but it is a reminder that in a democracy that's functioning, you get the government you deserve. And to some extent, we do need government leaders, just as we do business and civic leaders, to lean forward. And so I'm encouraging everyone to make a plan for how you intend to vote. Get everyone you know to make a plan in advance and execute on that plan, because we need massive participation from everybody, and then we need to go to work and deliver the actions that Juana and others have talked about and that the marchers in the street are demanding. Thank you all. Thanks for joining. Be safe. Be healthy. Take care.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.